It's winter time now, and that means winter projects. Maybe you finally refreshed that power steering system you've been ignoring, or that old broken clutch disc that needed to be replaced 5 years ago. Today, we're going to discuss all the parts that you need to replace while you're in there on BMW E36. If you read the title of this video, you already know what time it is. It's clutch time, baby. This is going to be a little mini series that I might be starting if you guys enjoyed this video. We're going to talk about all the things you need to replace while you're in there on the BMW E36, go through all the parts and talk about what you should replace, what you shouldn't, and cost to help you make the best decision while you're in there on your E36. See what I did there? So it's time to replace your clutch, or is it? Before we talk about what to replace when you're in there in a clutch shop, let's talk about some failure symptoms, because you may not even need a clutch, and not all clutch issues require you to actually remove the transmission. So first on our list, we're going to talk about slipping. If you're experiencing a slipping clutch disc, sorry to tell you, it is 100% of the time. The clutch disc, the material wears down and it can't do its job to hold the engine's torque properly, so between shifts or on hard acceleration, it's going to slip. That one does require the clutch to come out. The second issue you can have is no clutch pedal. So what do I mean by no clutch pedal? It means that your clutch pedal acts like a lever. So you press it in, and instead of coming back up to you, it stays at the floor. This is actually good news for you because the issue is probably not that big of a deal. Most of the time when this happens, it is something clutch hydraulic related. So either bad clutch master cylinder or clutch slave cylinder. You may even see fluid come out onto your driver's floor area. I really hope you have rubber floor mats if this happens to you, like I did. This indicates a master cylinder failure, but you can also go under the car and see if you're seeing fluid from the slave, or the line can be leaking and you may have lost enough pressure where the pedal cannot come up. Usually this will be accompanied by really stiff shifting, gear grinding, because you're going to have to fight the gears to get it in because clutch isn't fully disengaging like it's supposed to, so on and so forth. I would first try bleeding the hydraulics and see if that helps. If you don't see any leaky fluid, and if you bleed them and no air comes out, you probably have a failure somewhere. Sometimes the master or slave cylinder can internally fail, and if this happens, then you just have to replace them, and bleeding isn't going to help you. Frankly, if it were me and you're not really sure and you don't know the last time any of those parts have been replaced, I would replace the master and slave cylinder both and get a stainless steel line. Just be done with it. It'll also improve your clutch feel. Stainless steel line, definitely a big plus one. So then the other issue that you can have is a soft pedal. Soft pedal can also be clutch hydraulics. It really depends. It feels spongy. I would definitely lean hydraulics, but if it has consistent pressure but just feels light, this can also indicate something failed inside the bell housing, pressure plate, clutch fork failure, clutch fork pivot pin failure. And unfortunately, it kind of becomes a lot more dicey as to what it can be. If you bleed the clutch hydraulics or you replace them and you don't see any improvement and you verify that they're fine, then I would start prepping to pull the trans. So let's get into our list now. I'm going to break this video up into 4 categories. It's going to be your must-do items. These are items you cannot do the clutch without. Maybe you don't have the time or money to replace everything, or you just got to get by to a track day or some kind of weekend event. You just need it to work. This is what I would do. Category 2 is the mechanic recommendation. This should be the bare minimum if you're paying shop labor, and most mechanics will not do a clutch job without doing these items because they want happy customers. And it's a lot of the bare minimum, like while you're in their stuff, if you want the repair to last. Category 3 is going to be recommended. These are parts that I would replace. I would personally recommend you to replace if you have a little bit more of a budget, because you can save a lot of money while you're in there, but are not necessarily urgent to do with the work. And then 4 is going to be optional. As the title of that category may suggest, these are parts that are optional to do while you're in there. If you're on no budget, you can save yourself a lot of labor time by doing them now and replacing the parts while you're in there. I'm going to say that probably a lot more in this video. And now that we set the premise for how this is going to work, let's get into category 1. That's going to be the must-do items. So a clutch disc, obviously, the clutch pressure plate bolts, and exhaust hardware. These parts are pretty straightforward. You got to do the clutch because clutch is bad. Clutch pressure plate, you got to do because clutch pressure plate's the old one's probably not going to work with the new clutch, or it'll fail shortly after. The exhaust hardware is technically, I guess, not a requirement, but if your exhaust hasn't been off in a while and you don't have the hardware, there's a good chance you're not going to be able to put your exhaust back on, or you're going to have a really mad exhaust leak because nothing's going to go back up right. You'll snap bolts, whatever. just don't do it to yourself. Just buy the hardware. It's cheap. You'll probably be able to reuse it when you eventually pull it back apart again. Pricing for a job like this is probably, I want to say $300 to $400, maybe $500, but the way price has been going, unfortunately. It's not really recommended that you just replace the clutch, but if you really just need to get by and pulling the transmission is not a big deal for you, then you can do it that way. And it'll last probably a weekend or however long you need to go on a short term, assuming the other parts in the bell housing are also in good condition. Now moving on to our mechanic recommendation category, and this is going to be the pilot bearing, the throwout bearing, also known by BMW as the clutch release bearing, drive shaft guibo, bell housing bolts, rear main seal, clutch fork pivot pin, the release spring, flywheel resurface or replacement, flywheel bolts, and the selector rod joint on the trans side. Starting with the selector rod joint, these are one-time use, they're pressed to fit. It's kind of expensive and you might not want to do it, but trust me, you should do it now. It's really annoying to go back and replace later. Out of all the parts in the shift linkage, if you only do one, just do this one little joint. The others are easy enough to access. And if you don't replace it, then you'll have some playing gear. Even if it's only a year old, they're one-time use technically. I got away with reusing mine and there was noticeable more playing gear. Very small thing, but just worth noting. The rest of these parts are all recommended because they share one key factor. That being they all require the transmission to come out to be replaced again, other than the drive shaft guibo, but that one is just, it has to come off, pull the trans off, and it's a common consumable item. Please replace these parts. If you have a dual mass flywheel, you cannot resurface it. A little birdie down the street told me that you can, and I may or may not have seen it done before. But the reason you're not supposed to resurface them is because it's not just about the surface area on a dual mass flywheel that goes bad. The actual springs and the part that controls the dual mass portion that combines your flywheels together can go bad. And in a bad enough case, your dual mass flywheel can fail, and then you will have essentially two rotating masses rotating separately from each other in your driveline, which will create a bunch of slack. Not a good experience. Don't do that to yourself. There's a reason the manufacturer says not to do this, so bear it in mind at your own risk. FCP Euro offers a lot of single mass conversion kits. My M3 has the Vallejo kit, which is technically made for 328i, but it seems to hold the power okay. Click up here if you would like to see more about lighter flywheels and my opinion on them, where I delve into this topic further. The rear main seal is a common oil leak point on old cars, and even if it's not leaking, it's good to do preventatively if you don't know the last time it was done, because if it does start to leak and it leaks bad enough, it will leak oil onto your new clutch disc and it will ruin it, forcing you to have to pull the trans out again to do it. So it's not just as cut and dry as, oh, I have to top it out with oil. It can actually ruin your clutch disc, so definitely replace the rear main seal. The throwout bearing, pilot bearing, and the clutch fork, generally, the throwout or pilot bearing will fail more. It'll last longer than the clutch, but not enough for two clutches, so you just replace them. It'll help the operation. Clutch fork, you really don't want to run into issues with your clutch fork, because if it fails, or the spring breaks, it's just instant fail, transits to come out, there's nothing you can do about it. So just replace those parts, they're cheap. And a last note about the clutch fork pivot pin, a lot of people like to swap that little pin to brass or steel. It seems like a good idea on paper, less plastic, less things to break, but in practice, it's not really a good thing. There are consequences to doing that. First of all, the brass one has had reports of wearing worse than the plastic one, which kind of defeats the whole purpose of doing it. And then the steel ones have their own side effects. Really, I've never seen an issue with the plastic pivot pin unless it just hasn't been replaced. I mean, their car's still on their original clutch discs with the original plastic pivot pin. The only time which I would say switching away from that pin would be okay from plastic is if you have a race car or really heavy duty aftermarket clutch and you're afraid that it might just snap the pin in half, in which case, yes, there is a point in doing it. But the reason it's plastic is because if there's ever an overexertion of force on the clutch system, that pin is designed to wear down or break before anything else in your bell housing breaks. So it's designed to be like a fail-safe. So if you replace that, you're getting rid of that fail-safe, and then you can break a lot of other things. For reference on aftermarket clutches, I ran an FX Stage 2 clutch kit in my M3 for 2 years, 18,000 miles with the plastic pivot pin. Did not have any issues whatsoever. That is a heavy-duty Kevlar clutch. Pedal was really heavy. No wear on the pin. Looked totally fine when we pull it out. We replaced it anyway because we had it all apart. Part's cheap. But bear that in mind, really for any OE, OEM Plus application on a street car, I would just keep the stock plastic pivot pin. For pricing in this category, add on an additional probably $400 to $600. And now you can kind of see why it would make sense that you would do these things if you're paying shop labor, because for not that much extra money, you're just future-proofing the car so that you really don't have to worry about it later. And also why most mechanics won't do it without, because they want happy customers and they don't want people returning over dumb things. And the old question brought up, why didn't we do this while we were in there? not a conversation a mechanic wants to have with their customer. It would look very bad on them. As far as labor times go, I would expect probably about 7 to 10 hours. Really depends on what shop you go to. 7 hours is book time for just a clutch job. If you're doing well while you're in their stuff or the trans has been off a while, bolts get seized, I would say 7 to 10 is a pretty fair range. Most shops working on BMWs charge about $120 to $200 an hour. So you can do your own math, figure it out, but that's about what I would expect for this job. And now we have the recommended parts to replace, and on that list we have transmission detents with shift pins, notably if you have a ZF 5-speed gearbox, the input shaft seal, and the center support bearing. These don't cost too much, and they have to either have the trans removed or come pretty close to it to replace them. The other one that I think is really important is the shift pins or detents. Not all ZF 5-speeds have this issue, but there's a common thing in the BMW world, 5th gear lean, where your 5th gear, your shifter will hang out in the 5th gear gate, and it'll kind of not like to slide into 3rd nicely. Even if you don't have 5th gear lean, other symptoms of bad detents can be stiff shifting, trouble to enter reverse, trouble to enter 3rd gear. Doing the work will greatly improve the way the transmission shifts. I think it is one of the best, I guess I'll say, modifications or maintenance I've done to my M3. These shift pins and detents were just so nice. The shifter shifts like butter. I also threw in the Dynan short shifter, and oh, it is so amazing. Highly recommend doing that. Oh, and PS, the transmission has to come out to do the detents, so there's literally no better time to do it. Then the center support bearing requires the exhaust to come down again. You kind of have to partly drop the drive shaft. It's just, once you have it all apart, it's easy to do, and it's another wear component in your driveline. Pricing for this job, probably run an additional $300 to $500. In our worst case scenario, bringing our total to like, I want to say $2-ish grand. Add on maybe another 1 to 2 hours for the detents if you go to a shop, or the shop will send your transmission off to a shop to have it done. You may also need to buy the tools for them to do the detents. Link in the description below to find the tools, as well as all the parts listed in this video. Now, onto the optional category. The optional parts are the starter, your shift linkage rebuild, transmission mounts, output shaft seal for the transmission, clutch hydraulics, namely slave cylinder and stainless steel clutch line, optional master cylinder, and optional clutch delay valve delete, trans tunnel insulation, and the transmission brace, either replacement or powder coat. A lot of this list is pretty self-explanatory. Shift linkage wears out on old cars, and you can vastly improve the shifting. It only costs like $100, $150 for the kit. You get an optional kit like the Turner rebuild kit, which is what I went with, and again, made the shifter feel amazing. If you want to go with a chassis mounted shifter, I should say you need to buy aftermarket motor and trans mounts. I'm not going to go into that topic in this video. We'll make a video on that later this summer, but know that you need to do that. As far as the trans mounts go, I would just go OE. They're like 20 bucks. Honestly, even if they're only like a year or two old, I would just buy trans mounts anyway. They're so cheap on FCP Euro. Output shaft seal on the transmission. The reason I put the output shaft seal on the optional list is because it does not require the transmission to come out like the input shaft seal does. But these are old cars, they leak. Topping out trans fluid is not convenient. Honestly, I would just do it. I did it on mine. I would do both of them. Starter, you can do the starter from the top, the intake manifold side, but it's a huge pain. I was looking at it the other day with all of our parts apart on my M3, and you can do it from the top, the manifold off, but trust me, it's way easier from underneath. With the trans off, you have like free roam access under there. So I would just do the starter now if you have even the slightest suspicion that it's worn out or going bad. As for your trans brace, the trans brace, if it's damaged or you want a powder coat or anything, it has to come out to pull the transmission out. I would do it now. If you're worried about it rusting, also link in the description. I put some 3M cavity wax on mine, which is like almost like a fluid film, but it's more permanent than that. It coats the metal and, you know, a layer of like wax, I guess, sealing it off from oxygen, no rust. Super easy to apply. I put it on my trans brace, drive shaft, and I put some of it in the trans tunnel. With the heat, it actually expands and kind of creeps into areas, so it's actually a really good rust preventative measure. I would definitely do that if you live in an area where rust is an issue or it's very humid or moist. Then as for the trans tunnel insulation, this is your form special. The trans tunnel insulation over time, decades of heat cycling and existing, it degrades and starts to tear off, and it will start to droop down right onto your drive shaft guibo, creating an awful rubbing sound and destroying the insulation as well as the guibo. Ask me how I know. You have two solutions to this. Either remove it and you'll get some heat in the cabin, or you can buy a new one, which is ungodly expensive. You don't want to do that. But there is a third option, and the option that I personally prefer, and that is to get the M Sport part brackets. They bolt on top of your transmission mounts, and they brace the trans insulation against the trans tunnel, bracing it up so that it does not droop on your Grebo. They're only like 40 bucks. They look cool and they do the job. If you're a dirty purist like I am, but also budget-minded, this is the solution I would go with personally. Even if it's not drooping yet, eventually it will start to droop and you're gonna want these. So just buy them. And lastly, we're gonna talk about the clutch hydraulics. We kind of touched on this at the start of the video. I would just replace the slave cylinder with every clutch job regardless. And the stainless steel line, if you don't have it yet, I would do it. The rubber ones, they like to leak and it's not a fun time. Master cylinder is not really while you're in there, but if you're bleeding the clutch hydraulics anyway, it wouldn't hurt to do the master cylinder. So that's there. Now the last component we're gonna touch on with that is the clutch delay valve. So a lot of people like to delete this. I did, I would do it again. The purpose of the clutch delay valve is to slip the clutch a little bit via modulating your clutch hydraulic pressure. Just slip it a tiny bit to create a smoother shift. Around town, it is actually kind of nice and it does help you out because you don't have to do as much with your foot. But when you're trying to go for quick shifts, launches, any kind of hard performance driving, it translates to slower shifts and more clutch wear. Personally, I would delete it, but if you do want to have it in place, then I guess you can leave it in place. It doesn't really matter. They don't go bad. So if you did everything on this list, we're probably looking at a total of like $2,200 in parts and like probably 9 to 12 hours of shop labor. So that could really be a $3,500 clutch job. Big yikes. You could save money along the way by buying FCPs, OE labeled parts, or getting things that are not genuine BMW. You really shouldn't. These cars are old, there's no point. And not everything requires replacement every time. But these cars are now, the newest ones are like 25 years old. So they really need restoration as opposed to maintenance. So if you don't know the last time any of these things have been done, I would do probably everything on this list at least once, especially if the maintenance was not done along the way or you have no record of it, because really this is what it's going to take to keep it running like it did when it was new. So hopefully you learned something today on your E36, I guess, or E46 BMW. They're pretty transferable. If you enjoyed, make sure to like the video, subscribe if you're new, comment down below. What do you think of this series? Should we do more of them? If this video does well, I have a few others planned that we can do with various other parts in the car, but I see a lot of people asking about clutch jobs while you're in there. I've done like 3 of them on one car, unfortunately. So I have the list kind of down to a T at this point. So stay tuned for our future E36 content. The M3 project is coming along. There will be an update on that soon. Take care, and I will catch you later. Feels like I've been